Okay, we're back again with talking about Islam and their cultural encounters. In this section, we're going to talk about how Islam spread into different areas, mainly talking about 4 different areas. This is going to be covering pages 428 to 442, and later on we'll talk about a couple of other things. This Islamic civilization continued to spread, as we see on the map here. You see the different time periods and the different colors, kind of like we talked about in the last PowerPoint. And even after the Arab Empire fell apart, the religion continued to grow. A lot of different areas of expansion included India, Anatolia, West Africa, and Spain, which we'll talk about in the subsequent slides. After the conversion of the Turkic peoples of Central Asia, the Turks became the third group to spread Islam after the Arabs and the Persians. A series of invasions of northern India led to the creation of small sultanates. With the establishment of the Sultan of Delhi in 1206, their rule was more systematic but still relatively limited to its reach. Many converts became Buddhists who had left their faith, lower caste Hindus, and untouchables. There were also those who converted to avoid the jizya tax. As South Asia had a long tradition of mystics, Sufism had a great appeal to the common people. Sufi veneration of saints and various festivals gave Islam a popular practice. Sometimes Sufism was very similar to the Hindu traditions. Islam's base was in northwest and east of India. Only 20 to 25% of the population converted, and the central and southern reaches saw little conversion, if any. There was a very sharp cultural divide between Hindu and Muslim communities. Monotheistic Islam forbade images of divine and preached against overt sexuality, while Hindu art was full of representations of thousands of gods and sometimes depicted of very sensual and even erotic scenes. Muslims generally lived separately from the larger population as a distinct minority. This slide is going to talk about the differences between Islam and Hinduism. So we see in Islam, they were basically monotheistic, and we know monotheism means one God. In Hinduism, you see that they were polytheistic. They had a number of gods. We talked about that as far as Hinduism a lot earlier. In Islam, there were no representations of Allah. So you don't see pictures, any representations on any pottery, artifacts, or anything like that. In Hinduism, you have endless statues and images of the divine, the gods that we know that were in Hinduism. In Islam, there was an equality of all believers, so everybody in Islam was equal. In Hinduism, we've talked about the caste system, and we understand that there were levels of society as far as the caste system, and we couldn't move up or down, and you would be born into one and you would stay into that one. Also, remember, you couldn't marry from one caste to another. In Islam, there was the sexuality was modest. You had a lot of different ways in which sexuality was really hindered. And in Hinduism, there was a lot of sexual openness. Sikhism was founded by Guru Nanak, and he lived from 1469 to 1539. This faith blended Islam and Hinduism in a monotheistic faith that recognized reincarnation and karma. Now we'll talk about Anatolia and how Islam spread into that area. The Anatolian Peninsula suffered a brutal Turkish invasion that destroyed the Greek Christian rule and subjected many communities to massacres. When the existing state system and social order were shattered, large numbers of Turks immigrated to this area in an increasing number, and a number of Christians converted. As both were monotheistic faiths, this made conversion much easier than in polytheistic India. By 1500, the region had distinctly Turkish Muslim character in terms of language and culture. And we also know this is the Ottoman Empire. By 1500 also, this state became the most powerful empire in the Islamic world. We see that because of a small population of about 800 million people, it was easily to convert to Islam. And you had extensive disruption of Anatolian society when the Byzantine Empire had weakened. A lot of the slaves, a lot of famine, massacres, church properties were destroyed. Many discriminations were going about at that time. So a lot of the Christians came to believe that these disasters were proof that Islam was a true religion. The cultural barriers were less severe in Anatolia than India. Most people in Anatolia had already had a monotheistic background, which was Christian. And we'll talk about a lot of those things a little bit later when we get into Western Europe and how Christianity played a role in that area. Muslims respected Jesus. They had a respect for Jesus and the Christian scriptures. And understand the divide between Islam and Christianity was not as major as the one between Islam and Hinduism. So the Sufi missionaries built schools, mills, orchards, hospices, and places of rest for the travelers. In West Africa, and talk about the spread of Islam into the African continent. Islam came to West Africa by peaceful means. Muslim merchants traveled across Sahara and spread the faith to the urban trading centers of West Africa. Rulers found Muslim scholars to be useful administrators, and Islam had an appeal as a connection to a wider world. Islam was really an urban phenomenon in West Africa until the 19th century. While rulers sponsored buildings of mosques, libraries, and schools, there was little effort converting the larger rural world. Nonetheless, communities in the city saw themselves as part of a larger Islamic world. Remaining the culture of the urban elite, the villages of West Africa continued to practice their traditions and rituals. Sometimes elements of Islam were combined with existing faiths and practices, but there was no Islamization of the region. There was no large-scale Arab migration to West Africa. The case of Spain. In 711, Muslim, Arab, and Bourbon forces invaded Spain, which they called Al-Andalus in Arabic. They quickly conquered the peninsula and established a caliphate. Islam spread very widely in the south. At its height, Muslim Spain was prosperous, culturally dynamic, and cosmopolitan. It was also a time of tolerance with special taxes for Jews and Christians, but general acceptance for them in the society. The city of Cordoba was the center of this golden age. In this time, Al-Andalus was a major center of learning. A number of Greek and Arabic books were collected and translated in the libraries. In the late 900s, as Christian kingdoms in the north began a series of wars, the Muslim rulers became increasingly intolerant of Christians, and social conflicts developed between the communities. Also in this series of wars, the Christians gradually conquered all of the peninsula, with Granada falling in 1492. The new Spanish monarchy forced many Muslims and some 200,000 Jews to immigrate. Converts, while initially tolerated, were later forced out of Spain. Next, we'll talk about the world of Islam as a new civilization. While Islam has no priesthood, as no mortal can stand between an individual and God, a class of learned scholars and experts developed. Known as the ulama, they made up an international elite of scholars, students, judges, and administrators from West Africa to Southeast Asia. Islamic schools, known as madrasas, spread throughout the Islamic world. These schools were generally conservative and focused on the memorization and recitation of the Quran. Sufism was responsible for much of the spreading of Islam into the new areas. These Sufi mystics were willing to engage with local spiritual traditions and rituals. thus forming a bridge between pre-Islamic and Islamic ideas and practices. Often, Sufis were willing to recognize local saints and other figures, winning over the community. Sufi sheikhs were teachers who attracted loyal students that followed their specific devotional practices and teachings. Sufi poets, such as Rumi, produced works of literature and had an appeal within the outside of the Islamic world. You had an annual pilgrimage to Mecca, which did much to forge an international community of Muslims and a wider sense of the Ummah. The Islamic world tied together Afro-Eurasia by linking the Mediterranean, the Trans-Saharan trade, and the Silk Roads, the Indian Ocean basin, and Chinese ports. Arab and Persian merchants played a leading role in this vital trading system. As the Prophet Muhammad was himself a merchant, as the elites of the Islamic world were very urban, the greater Islamic world brought together a culture friendly to commerce with cities eager to consume. Thus, the greater Islamic economy benefited from the linkage of long-range trade and dynamic cities. The trade routes also served to transport technological innovations, ideas, and crops. New weapons such as rockets and useful administrative tools such as paper spread west from China. Texts from Greece, the Hellenistic world, and India were translated into Arabic and inspired Muslim scholars to build upon these earlier works. Crops, especially citrus, cotton, and sugar, moved from the Islamic world, as did new irrigation techniques, leading to a dramatic increase in food production and population growth. Here you see the House of Wisdom, where a lot of the Muslim scholars went. They translated those texts. They taught other Muslims. They did a lot of things to advance all of the revolutions that were taking place during this time period. Using a numeric system from India, Muslim scholars made important advances in mathematics and astronomy. Using Greek and Indian medical knowledge, they developed early hospitals, diagnosed diseases, developed chemical-based treatments, and performed operations for things such as cataracts and hernias. This medical knowledge entered Europe via Spain and was a state-of-the-art for medical knowledge for many centuries. We see on this slide that the physician we talked about earlier, Al-Razi, and they diagnosed many diseases such as hay fever, measles, smallpox, diphtheria, etc. The doctors started hernia operations, cataract, and also filling teeth with gold. So we see a lot of different things that came out of this time period that we still use today. This will conclude Chapter 9. Make sure that you study all of the assigned PowerPoints for your test that will be coming up soon.